After such horrors that were done to us, our Russians, in this war, I would not want peace with Ukraine.
Talks about possible Russia-Ukraine peace negotiations have been going on for some time now. But do Russians really want peace? To try to comprehensively answer this question, we've gathered the latest data from public opinion polls, interviews, and independent sociological studies.
Is it a secret? It's no secret. For Putin, of course.
And documentaries, as well as excerpts of propaganda material. There will be no compromise. We are Great Russia. We have to remember that polling public opinion in a society operating under a totalitarian regime is very difficult. People are afraid to express their true opinion for fear of repercussions. Under censorship, the questions themselves often impact the answers. Therefore, sociologists are moving away from quantitative methods towards qualitative ones, such as in-depth interviews.
Let's first look at how Russians in general relate to the war. According to opinion polls regularly conducted by centers considered to be relatively independent, such as, for example, the Levada Center, we see that support for the war is high and remains stable. In recent months, this support has been in the order of 80%. Interestingly, the mood and expectations regarding the course of the war are also improving. Russians believe that the situation at the front is developing in a favorable direction for Russia, and that in general the whole situation related to the war is favorable for Russia. So as far as support for the war is concerned, at the moment it is at a level of more or less 80% of those surveyed. In terms of expectations and the assessment of the situation on the front line, at the moment about 72% of those surveyed state that the situation is moving in a good direction. We saw a much worse mood in this respect at the end of August and the beginning of September last year, which was directly related to the Ukrainian incursion into the Kursk Oblast and the whole atmosphere caused by this event. The Russians did not expect that hostilities could spill over into Russian territory, and this caused a downfall in the mood, exasperation, and just generally a negative assessment when it came to the situation at the front. The current better mood and better expectations in terms of the course of the war are directly linked to the action of Russian propaganda, which we have been watching for a long time. At the moment, the mood in the propaganda is much better. You can see the confidence in the propagandists, presenting accounts of how well the Russians are doing at the front, how they are gaining more territory, and this is also reflected in the Russians' belief that the so-called special military operation is going well for Russia, and the public need not fear any negative consequences. If we look at the broader context of how the war is perceived in Russian society, several important points must be noted. First and foremost, the Russian authorities have managed to mobilize Russians for the war in a very effective way, in such a way that the general public barely notices that there is a war going on at all. This is also reflected in the fact that Russians consider the war to be quite distant from them, and that they have no direct responsibility for the course it takes. Let's look at the model of mobilization, the model of recruiting Russians for the war. First, the Russian authorities are mobilizing Russians from areas further away from the European center of the country, from more rural areas, small towns and environments where people are less likely to resist, and they don't have the instruments to fight for their rights if they do not want to go to the war voluntarily. Secondly, the financial factor is also very important here, because the Russian government turned war into a business. They have made it the basis for a new model of relations between the state and society, a new model of social relations, which is a contract. The state pays huge amounts of money to Russians who take part in the war, in return for them going to the front and making sacrifices. One other important factor concerns the families of all the people taking part in the war. These are mobilized soldiers, including those forcibly mobilized, as well as contract soldiers who go voluntarily. Perhaps with the exception of prisoners, the families of all these groups are covered by state social assistance programs. These take on a variety of forms. For example, the children of these families have preferential conditions of entry into university and other treatment. There are plenty of social benefits associated with participation in the war, and looking at the economic landscape of Russian society, this is a significant social incentive. In no other circumstances would Russians be able to earn as much money as they do in this war. As for the financial terms of signing a so-called contract with the Russian army, they vary from region to region. We have recent data from St. Petersburg, which is one of the highest paying regions for people signing up there. A person who signs a contract on the spot can get a one-time payment of over 2 million rubles, which is around $25,000. If we add up all the benefits that this person will get over the course of a year, it would be over 5 million rubles, which is over $62,000. In Russia, this really is a lot of money and a very substantial incentive. Importantly, in the eyes of society, enlisting in the army on commercial terms is not met with opposition. People simply accepted the fact that they go to war to kill Ukrainians for money. This is seen as a pragmatic attitude towards reality. Since the war is already here and since we can't do anything about it, even if we oppose it, it makes sense to take advantage of the circumstances being offered by the state, because they may not happen again in the future. I think that this line of thinking is characteristic of very many Russians who are enlisting now under these conditions, and their families too. Here, propaganda plays an important role in building acceptance and support for the war, even if it's passive in nature. Propaganda creates a vision of heroic Russian soldiers who are fighting for Russia's independence, for Russia's place in the world. And what's important, they are fighting in a defensive war, and this is also reflected in society. Those soldiers who manage to return are rewarded. Propaganda comments on this a lot, and this image of soldiers as new heroes, new veterans, is created. New programs of assistance for veterans or some kind of new career path for them are also being created. And this is where the state authorities come in. They offer a program for integrating veterans from the so-called special military operation into the state administration, into the regional authorities. On the level of average citizens, this also has an impact on the perception of war and the increase of its acceptance, because, as I said, Russians see the war as an opportunity to change their own personal situation, mainly in material terms. To sum up, Russians are ready to fight, but for money, while there is no consensus in society on the kind of forced mobilization we saw just after the start of the war in September. This was the so-called partial mobilization, where soldiers were forcibly recruited, and this caused a very big stir in society, as well as in propaganda. We reported on propaganda reactions to the various problems in the army, to various mistakes, to corruption schemes, and so on. This was seen very negatively in society. The authorities are afraid of this kind of forced mobilization and are doing everything to encourage Russians to enlist in the army voluntarily. The second very important issue in terms of Russians' perception of how this war is going, what the war is in general, is that the majority of Russian society, in my opinion, does not have such a realistic, authentic idea of what the war is. Let's recall here that, for example, the number of casualties plays an important role in this aspect. On the one hand, Russians know that the war is going on and that it is the new normal. In Russia, in surveys, 28% of Russians recently indicated that someone close to them, someone from their family, was involved in the so-called special military operation, because this is how these questions are phrased in surveys. On the other hand, the information about how many people died, which is very important information about the costs of the war for society, this information does not reach the public consciousness. And this is primarily because of the very clever way in which the authorities in Russia conduct mobilization. How is it that this information does not reach Russian citizens? First and foremost, the Russian authorities have largely, and perhaps above all, mobilized for this war or forcibly recruited people who do not play a great role in society. Their presence or absence in society may go unnoticed. These are people, to put it bluntly, who are disposable for the functioning of society. Primarily, they were recruited in prisons. If we look at aggregate data based on the results of the BBC and Mediazona project at who the people who died on the Russian side in the war in Ukraine were, first of all, about a fifth of these people came from the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. The second very important group, probably the most important, were people who were recruited from prisons. This was a very important practice in terms of recruitment, especially at the beginning of the war. People who were recruited in prisons, for example, played a very important role in the attack and capture of Bakhmut, and they died en masse there. Now, if we set them against the total number of people who died, Prisoners make up about a third of the total number of deaths. The others are volunteers and contract and professional soldiers. Now let's look in detail at the breakdown of all the soldiers into these different groups in this BBC material.
Давайте еще раз суммируем.
Let's once more summarize the numbers and the conclusions. If we imagine all the fallen in this war on the Russian side as 10 people, 2 of them are soldiers from the so-called DPR and LPR, about whom the Russians know very little. Another 3 are prisoners sent to the front from penal colonies, who had been isolated from society for years anyway. The losses among the others break down as follows. 2 people out of 10 are volunteers who signed up after the invasion began. 1 person is a mobilized soldier, and 1 is a professional soldier. What do Russians think about the idea of making peace? According to the Levada Center, the vast majority of those surveyed say that the war will end on favorable terms for Russia. This was the opinion of 76% of those surveyed. In contrast, when we look at the research of the independent project Russian Field, 40% of respondents would like peace talks to begin, while 44% want the fighting in Ukraine to continue.
From the surveys we have quoted, and also from various others, we can conclude that what might be called a peace-seeking approach, a strive for peace, deliberations on the sensibility of starting peace talks in Russia, are gaining more and more supporters. That this idea of negotiating peace is reaching the public and it's gaining support in the consciousness of Russians. What we can therefore say now is that Russians support these ideas of launching peace talks. The point here is that they also have a growing feeling, a greater group of people have this feeling, that this war will end quite quickly. If you look at the surveys that have been conducted regularly asking about the feeling of when the war will end, how Russians feel about it, you can see that now, that in early 2025, more and more Russians feel that this war will end in the relatively near future, that is, within 1 year or less.
Will we be able to rebuild relations with Europe and with the US after the Ukrainian conflict? I think things will normalize with the US, yes, and Europe will split into those who support us and those who don't. I don't know, I doubt it. So much damage has been done to us here, I don't know. I think we will come to terms, but on our terms. I don't know why, but I think we won't. There's a 50-50 chance. I think we won't. But I think on some things it is possible. It's difficult to say, rather not. And would you like that to happen? Sure, after all, we all want peace. I would very much like this conflict we have here to end. As for reconciliation with the USA, we have a very negative attitude towards them, very negative. And after such horrors that were done to us, our Russians in this war specifically, I would not want peace with Ukraine.
The second such important indicator in terms of the mood about the war is that as Russians have started to think more about peace and consider when the war might end, there has also been a certain change in awareness of what public money should be spent on. As recently as last year, when we were looking at those surveys which focused solely on budget spending, it was clear that Russians thought that the army was the priority, that more money needed to be spent on armaments. At the moment, more and more Russians think it's necessary to increase spending on social needs, that is, on social welfare, on taking care of citizens, not on armaments. 48% of those surveyed think it is necessary to increase social spending, while a year ago in September, this was only 38%. This increase may not be spectacular, but it nevertheless indicates that Russians feel that the state's priorities should in fact shift in a different direction than just armaments and war. On the other hand, 36% of those surveyed now believe that social spending should be increased, versus 43% who said that military spending should be increased a year earlier. We've already mentioned how the Russians relate to the idea of peace talks. Now let's look at, based on the available data, how the Russians see the war ending and under what conditions it should end.
What fate awaits Ukraine? We cannot talk about Ukraine here, rather about the territories that formerly belong to Ukraine. It seems to me that the lands that formerly belong to Ukraine will face a partition similar to the partition of Poland. After all, we do not need anything that is not ours. That is how it's always been. We will take our Russian territories, lands inhabited by people who share our culture, our history, our language, who want to live with us in one country. You remember in this studio, I think you asked a question, where should we stop? Where they're waiting for us. That's what I said, where we're welcome. There will be a buffer zone in the middle so that those who don't like us cannot harm those who want our presence. And what will happen behind the buffer zone? Well, there will be those willing to divide it up. Whether it is de jure annexation or some kind of twisted protectorate, a favorite ploy of the West, it will happen in one form or another. And it could have been avoided by simply behaving and not arguing with us.
And a very important factor is that the Russians have their red lines. The main one is that the Russians cannot imagine that they would give Ukraine back the territories seized in the course of the special military operation. If we look at opinion polls conducted by independent centers, this is absolutely a red line for 53% of those surveyed. From the point of view of the Russian public, as far as the return of the seized territories is concerned, the matter is closed, and they will not negotiate on this topic at all. And while the Russians might not support the war, just accept it passively, they do support their government and are ready to support any decision it makes. Even if they decided to end the fighting and withdraw, perhaps some of the troops from the occupied territories in Ukraine, a part of Russians would accept this decision, seeing in it some deeper justification and simply the decisions of the government. What's interesting is that this cult of power, this belief that a strongman rule, that the decisions of the state are correct, this runs very deep in society. Even in situations like this, where Russians are suffering personal costs, they are able to push this aside and support the government regardless. We see this in the accounts of ordinary Russians.
Here in Vishera, probably 16 people have already died. 16 people is a lot. I received a call up to the army and gave it to him myself. I didn't think they would take him. They said mobilization is up to the age of 35, and he was already 41, so he shouldn't be considered. He did his basic service in Maikop, then he served in Abkhazia on a contract. Before the mobilization, before they took him away, he was working as a driver in a company. He was good, he had a good character, he wasn't bad, he never argued, he always found compromises. He couldn't not go. If they said, you have to go, who am I to stay here? He had 2 young children, he rather shouldn't have gone.
Хотя у него 2 маленьких детей, и мог бы, наверное, не ходить туда.
Well, many probably go because of the money. I have a friend who really wants to go to the special military operation. He wants to sign a contract immediately. He is about to graduate from school with a medical degree, and I think our country needs such military men. He says he has nothing to lose. If he dies, he dies. And I say to him, what are you talking about? Dying is not an option. No way. After all, you're my friend. And then I just understood that if he wants to, let him go. It's his decision. He's going of his own free will. Let him go. We don't even watch the news so as not to be saddened by it all. We don't get into a state of general hysteria. There are people who take it personally, but we try to stay as far away from it as possible. We are here and it doesn't get to us, the things that are actually taking place there. Those who manage to stay alive, they come back. All of these men are broken. Not everyone can stand it. He came for a holiday, and his psyche was already completely different. They are so ragged. I feel he wants to talk, but he doesn't. Mama, you don't need this. What are our children dying for over there? I understand that you have to defend their homeland, but what conditions were they under there? It's a one-way ticket. I am obviously not firmly in politics, but I think they know what they are doing there. Of course, I don't support people going to war, and boys in their 20s. Why are they there? They're not military men or anything. I don't support that either, but I voted, of course. If it's not a secret, who did you vote for? For Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. Why for him? I don't even know. Our lives used to be even worse, and compared to now, I think we live well. What do we need? We need peace. Most importantly, there is nothing more important. You want peace, you don't want war. You want there to be peace. You feel powerless. What can you say? We cannot change anything. I don't know what will happen next. And did you go to the elections? I literally just cast my vote. And can you say for whom? Is it a secret? It's no secret. For Putin, of course. And why? Because without Putin, maybe there would be nothing of what we have now. We would be stuck in the 1990s. This year I voted for the first time. I received a sweatshirt. I am very happy. For Putin. And why for Putin? I don't know. I just like this candidate and I voted for him. On my own. No one told me. That's the way it happens. So that's the way it should be. People choose him not just like that. Many people vote for him. That's why he wins.
While on the propaganda level, on the other hand, this building of a cult of the individual, reassuring Russians that Putin is all-powerful and cares about society, at times takes on absurd forms.
Vladimir Vladimirovich, welcome back. Excuse me, I'm looking at the clock. It's 2:30 in the morning. Today you've had 5 public events and, judging by what we've seen, some 35 others. Well, more or less. Yes, what can I get for you? What can I treat you with? No need to treat us with anything, thank you very much. Why? We just wanted to look at you. Let's go and see what we have. We'll find something. How about a kefir? I may have some kefir. I also have buttermilk. And at this late hour, do you happen to allow yourself kefir or maybe even a light supper? Well, I try not to eat at this time anymore. Please sit down. Is it all from Russia? Yes, of course. Where else could it be from?
Well, the next day, the Russian media were gushing about how Russians rushed to the shops to buy this kefir, simply appreciating that Putin also drinks kefir. So we can see here that, on the one hand, the propaganda creates Putin's image. On the other hand, there is also a ground base in society ready to accept these decisions of the strong hand of power, even when it comes to war. In opinion polls, we see that as many as 75% of Russians would be prepared to accept the decision to stop military action as early as this week, if Putin were to take it. This is much higher than the number of people overall who are in favor of entering peace talks. Here we can see how important this factor is, if the decision is taken by the government or not. When it comes to attitudes towards peace talks in general, one other thing which plays a very important role is that the propaganda now constantly says that Russia wants peace, that Putin wants peace. It's being spelled out in all the Russian media, and Putin is also being shown saying that peace talks are needed, that Russia has a sincere desire to end the war. And this is being circulated by the media. It's Ukraine that is being blamed in the Russian messaging for ruining these peace talks, for being unconstructive, for coming into conflict with the United States, and so on. All of this translates into a belief among the Russian public that Russia has honest intentions to make peace, and that it's in its interest to do so, and that this may somehow soon take place.
Vladimir Putin has been clear about his conditions. We are not interested in negotiations. We do not need some kind of deal. We need to fulfill the conditions set by the head of our armed forces, Putin. Of course, the head of the armed forces said something important, that we are ready for negotiations with the US. But what should these negotiations lead to? To the fulfillment of our demands. Putin has said this many times. For those who do not understand well enough, we are ready, but our conditions must be fulfilled. I think, Vladimir, that in the current situation there is a possibility in the world that this new government will solve these problems, including the Ukrainian issue, and so they will look for a compromise. There can be no compromise with our interests. We have hard interests. And I deeply understand this. I'm not even arguing. But I believe that if we enter into a negotiation process, we will not enter into a negotiation process. That is the fundamental difference. We say we are ready to talk, but we make clear demands that have to be met. That's all. Besides, the war is taking place on our constitutional territory, and the government says that all the goals of the special military operation must be fulfilled. But we will talk about these goals with the new US administration. No, we will not talk to them about our goals. What do they have to do with our goals? We will talk with them about the new world order, not about today's battlefield, about Ukraine, which nobody cares about. We are going to talk about what the world order should be. That is exactly what the December 2021 letter is about, not the fate of Ukraine. It's not a question of compromise, but if there is dialogue, dialogue by all means. But the basis of dialogue is the fulfillment of our demands. Compromise is when each side gives something up, and we are not giving up anything. We cannot compromise our national interests. The Ukrainian national interest does not exist for us. But if you say there is no dialogue here, then what is the future of Ukraine? I don't care about the future of Ukraine. But that's what the conversation with the US is about. No, of course not. But it's necessary to discuss the territories of Ukraine which will remain under Russian rule, which will be neutral. Why should we discuss keeping our territories with them? And what else? What interest do they have in this? These are our constitutional territories. What do the Americans have to do with it? F them. We have made it clear. We do not care one bit about the fate of Ukraine. We are going to talk about the new global security architecture. And that is the important issue. A new security architecture is not possible without dialogue and compromise. Without dialogue, it is not possible, but compromise has nothing to do with it. We have clearly and precisely said what we want. There will be no compromise. We are Great Russia. If the Americans are not able to understand this and they start talking to us rudely, then we'll shift to a completely different tone, a very brutal one, and Europe will be the first to tremble. We must go down the road of escalation and wipe everything off the face of the earth, especially Ukraine. Chronicles is an independent research project which conducts more complex research into public support for the war than the Levada Center. For the purposes of their research, sociologists have introduced the terms consistent supporters of war and consistent peace supporters. Each of these terms contains a set of views. A consistent supporter of war is one who fully supports the Kremlin's actions and is against stopping the so-called special military operation. According to Chronicles, this is 18% of society. In contrast, consistent peace supporters make up 21% of those surveyed. At the same time, the number of Russians who do not want to withdraw troops from Ukraine without achieving the goals of the so-called special operation is increasing. This is up to 46%. In the research made available by the Extreme Scan project, 41% of Russians surveyed would like to see peace talks begin, while 46% are in favor of continuing the war.
And these surveys, juxtaposed with surveys that have previously been conducted, indicate that there is more of this radical, more militant and hawkish sentiment in Russian society. Important factors that are influencing how Russians perceive the war and how it's being prosecuted now are factors such as primarily the change in relations between Russia and the United States and the peace talks already underway. The second very important factor is the attitude of Russian propaganda, which argues that the Russians are doing very well on the front line. Of course, there is also the objective factor that the Russians are on the offensive. It might be going slow, but they are nevertheless moving forward. From the Russian point of view, it's irrelevant what size or scale these territorial gains are. What matters is the mere fact that the propaganda has a genuine excuse to present this victory propaganda and how well the Russians are doing in this war. It is worth quoting the statements of propagandists who, precisely on the wave of such euphoric moods, claim that Russia does not need peace at all, and that Russia should go all the way in this war. That's one thing. And the other thing is also what the opinion polls show, that Russians evaluate Trump's policies and Trump's actions as favorable to Russia.
Well, but how can any agreements be taken seriously at all in a system when the leader changes every 4 years and can easily annul previous arrangements? It's ridiculous. That's why agreements, any agreements, even agreements signed today, are just a decorative attribute so that the education of those involved doesn't go to waste. Please show me at least one agreement made in recent years that has been honored. Maybe the Minsk agreements. It's all a laughingstock. Here, both the arrangements and our institutions and entire ministries, many really smart people who managed our foreign exchange reserves, they did not rely on arrangements when they invested our money abroad. After all, they thought these guarantees were untouchable, on solid ground. Of course. But what happened? It's all one big joke. It seems to me that anyone who has followed our geopolitical reality, if only for the last 30 years, cannot seriously say that we agree with anyone on anything or that there are any arrangements. We have an army and a navy and the channel of Dmitry Medvedev.
In a survey from early March, we see that more than 70% of Russians believe that Trump's actions are beneficial for Russia and view them positively. The second result of the survey, which confirms what I said earlier concerning propaganda and the positive portrayal of the situation on the battlefield, is that today, more or less 70% of Russians believe that the situation on the front line is favorable for Russia, that it is Russia that is dealing the cards, that Russia has the initiative. As a result, there is simply less of this motivation and this incentive to discuss any concessions, negotiations, or peace talks, because the Russians know they're doing well in Ukraine and that they don't have to give up anything. It must be mentioned here that I am talking about opinion polls which, of course, have their restrictions, and I'm not talking about all the Russians. Let's remember that there is a part of society that opposes the war, that opposes the government, and these people also function in Russia. They are less visible in surveys because they are afraid to respond. What is more, we also can't generalize and extrapolate these aggressive, more militant opinions to the whole of society. Now, let's summarize Russian society's approach to the war, government decisions, and the perception of the war in the eyes of the public today. Donald Trump coming to power and initiating contacts with Russia, and a general change in the perception of the war in the international arena, which Trump has initiated by presenting a tolerant attitude towards Russia, letting it state its reasons, has caused the appetites for victory in Russian society and its conditions to significantly increase. Right now, the majority of Russians expect an easy, simple, and quick victory, and America's attitude reinforces their expectations of this. The second point is that because the Kremlin is very efficient in mobilizing and recruiting people into the army who are more economically vulnerable, people from remote regions, prisoners, and so on, there are no significant social tensions, and we are also not seeing any great tensions in Russia related to the war. And this is allowing the Kremlin to continue the fight. Right now, in the eyes of Russian society, the war is the new reality, as well as a prospect and a chance to make money. Colloquially speaking, it's a cash cow that is able to secure people's financial situation and the careers of numerous social groups that previously did not have that opportunity. We're not talking about the people directly involved in combat, but also the entire arms sector, which is operating at full capacity. Because people have been recruited for the front line, there is a shortage of manpower in Russia. This means that the wages in various other sectors of the country, not only in armaments and not only directly at the front, have increased, which then generally creates favorable conditions for Russian society, for certain groups of it. It can also be seen that in some groups, the real income of society has increased, which also projects a sense of satisfaction with the situation in the country that we have seen in Russia recently. From the point of view of society and propaganda activities in general, the Russian government is in a very favorable position. I think that despite the fact that the peace narrative has been spun in recent weeks and months, if a decision is made to change this narrative, Russian propaganda would be able to do so without any major problems. On the other hand, it's also a fact that a part of Russian society is obviously tired of the war, and this too can be seen in various reports in Russia and in various studies, that Russians simply retreat inwards when confronted with the war. They don't want to talk about it. On the one hand, they are afraid of it, and on the other hand, it also causes some unpleasant emotions, so they prefer to avoid the subject. And this too manifests itself, for example, in the statements of the Russians who say that we don't want to be hysterical, we do what we have to do, we have no influence on anything. This is such a typical attitude in Russian society, where there's a conviction that a single person cannot influence politics, that it's better to keep a low profile, because if someone steps out of line, they will have problems, and so on. This is also, of course, very skillfully fueled by the state. We can see the war fatigue, but so far it has had a dormant dimension to it. If we look at the long-term propaganda activities of the government, we can see that these are not aimed at peace. I am referring above all to mass propaganda and indoctrination, not only through television, but mainly at the institutional level, through schools, through the school curriculum, through the education system, including at that lowest, most early stage, which is nursery school. This is also where propaganda has actively entered and is working to normalize war among children, to prepare children to fight, to sacrifice themselves for the homeland. Civic activists in Russia are appealing in these issues that the system of indoctrination of children and young people is massive. This is a huge machine which will have dramatic consequences for these young people, who will have a completely different perception of reality than, for example, we in the West, or than those societies and generations of Russians who grew up during the transition period and used to have access to, let's say, the free media and some civil liberties. These actions of the government are directed towards the emergence of a new social group, a younger one, which will be aggressive. This fills me with anxiety, and I think this is an issue that we'll face in the years to come. And with this issue, with this question, I leave you until our next program.